Welcome to the Learning to Die podcast.
I'm Ian Doonican.
And I'm Ciaran O'Regan.
How do I live when I know I must die?
We explore areas of philosophy, psychology, martial arts, culture, existential risk, history, society, religion, science, and anything else that seems of interest and relevance to answering that question.
We can only hope that some of what we learn might be of benefit to you too. Namaste, sapiens. Welcome back to the Learning to Die podcast. Been a crazy few weeks, Ciaran. We have the decline of the COVID pandemic, and all of a sudden, apparently, well, not here in Western Australia. Topic for another day. We've had the decline of the COVID pandemic in probably most of the world, and then as a nice segue or a transition out, because we have to seem to have some world problem. Which reminds me of Shakespeare. The world is a stage, and the fucking theater at the moment, because now we have a war in Ukraine and Russia. And I think we're on about, today is the 3rd of March, which would mark about 1 week, I think, into this war. So probably by the time we release this episode, I think a lot of things will have changed. But yeah, crazy time in the world. We've got crazy politics in the US. We've got this war in Ukraine. We've got the COVID crisis still occurring. We've got in the background the threat of nuclear war. We have the environmentalists jumping up and down about stuff as well. We've got other stuff happening in the Western world around, I suppose, what would you call it? Diversity, inclusion, and equity. Which is we'll talk about today as well, because it's intermingled with some of the stuff in Ukraine. And on top of that, you know, add in your own layer of shit, whatever's gone in your region, to add into that. So it's just becoming piled up on top of each other every day, and people are probably stressed out. But yeah, that's kind of a quick summary of what's happening in the world today. And we're not BBC, but fuck me. You only laugh at it, you know?
And the angle that we want to talk about this, the various angles we want to talk about this from, are the angles that we're not necessarily seeing on other media outlets. So we kind of made the decision not to try and be war pundits. Yeah. You know, all of a sudden fucking experts on Ukraine in terms of war and in terms of, you know, just like getting way out of our depth and that front. We're not trying to, but I think in keeping with the podcast and the theme of the podcast so far, and what we've put a lot of time thinking about, are more some of the kind of philosophical questions underneath what's going on, and these philosophical implications of what's going on in terms of values, and in terms of what this could mean for us, and what I think in particular, what I think the Ukrainian question genuinely is, when you pull away all the death and all the human suffering, and you take that away, you look at what's actually going on right there from a fundamental philosophical level, what's going on. And that's the kind of thing that we want to explore, not trying to analyze Putin's tactics or or the various hypotheses as to why he might be there, which are interesting to ponder. But that's the kind of angle, in case anyone who's listening is sick of all this Ukraine, and sick of all the kind of pundits who the same pundits that were jumping up and down and made a bollocks of COVID, who for years have been jumping up and down and making climate change out to be the fucking most dangerous thing humans are facing, while blatantly ignoring the nuclear demon that was always present and staring them in the face. Yet they just seem to think, oh, this demon will never be summoned. And they failed to have anything that resembled an awareness that a bad pandemic could happen. And we're then supposed to trust them now. So many of the same people. So we need to, how we cannot forget the failures and then think, okay, now we're supposed to trust these same people when they're beating the drums of war and when they're putting fuel on a fire that if the spark gets lit, might be the last fire that's ever lit. So what's really important, I think, is for us to try and have a go off peeling back layers and at some of the key questions, because then that lets us know if we're ready to try and light that spark. You know, that to me is the question, that they're the questions that are worth exploring at the moment, because that's not what's being talked about. It's like all of a sudden nuclear war is like on the cards, as if it wasn't for the last.
Yeah, but this is nearly, Ciaran, this is like, you've been talking about this now for a few episodes, and we've done 3 episodes on, like, we did Hiroshima and nuclear near misses before this was even in the news. And you've been talking about this and writing about this as well, and some other published articles on Areo and a few other platforms as well. So I think the same pundits that switch from, we'll say, COVID to nuclear war, as if like, or the potential for nuclear war or nuclear weapons, they went, oh, I can't believe this is happening, are the same pundits that were like, I can't believe a pandemic is happening. And all we have to do is not look too far back in history. We're not saying look back to the Roman Empire. We're saying look back 100 years when we had the Spanish flu, and then we had other flus and pandemics or potential pandemics in the 50s or in the 60s with the Asian flu and stuff like this. We've had these warning shots across the bow, SARS and Ebola and all these things. Now, whether you believe it came from a lab or was man-made or whatever, we're not getting into that, but these things have happened. And numerous countries pare back money for pandemics, and businesses eliminated. I know multiple businesses that eliminated pandemic plans because, like, when have we had a pandemic? No need for putting money into that and having plans. Get rid of that. What's the point in doing that? And it's the same type of people now that would have been like, nuclear war. Sure, the Cold War's over. We don't have to worry about that. Well, guess what, bitches? It's back. It's fucking Cold War 2. And that's what's emerging now. And so for all those people.
But we've been told by so many of these same pundits, we've been told, and I think it's worth being clear that this isn't to say that the mainstream pundits are going to be wrong about everything. Of course, they might very well be right about nearly everything they're saying, but we have to be very measured about how we formulate our opinions about what the right measures are and how hard to push and what to do. And that's because, and we'll get into that, but the same, we have to remember that these are the same pundits that were justifying, a lot of these people are the same pundits that were justifying quote unquote anti-racism riots or protests that became, some of them became riots after George Floyd was killed, because apparently that was justified, but anti-lockdown protests weren't, because they were too dangerous because it was a pandemic.
Yeah, that happened here in Australia.
These are a lot of the same pundits that are from organizations that are totally fine pointing out that J.K. Rowling is a fucking transphobe Nazi or whatever. You know, like that diversity and inclusion and equity is the fact that there's not an exact breakdown per identity characteristic in every organization is the sign of the apocalypse.
Yeah.
You know, like there's this focus on, like we said, climate change. And so, like, when we look at the hysteria where we had media that fucked up the beginning of the pandemic, gross underreaction at the beginning of the pandemic, and then a prolonged overreaction towards the back end of the pandemic after the most vulnerable had already been vaccinated and boosted, and after a load of the most vulnerable had already died. To be really bluntly, already, unfortunately, there was a huge amount of people that died prematurely who were already really sick and who died prematurely in 2020 and early 2021, but then who were advocating for triple vaccinating 5-year-olds and having social distance sex. You know, this is like, these are the same fucking pundits. Like, so, like, we have to be really aware of, again, I'm caveating that again with, there may very well be a load that these same people are saying just because, and it's the same with us, like, just because we might be on the mark with some things, we could be grossly wrong in other things that we don't realize. We all have our blind spots, and every issue is different. But I think,
Ciaran, I would like to, but Ciaran, just on that point, I would like to think that you and I would have the maturity and the ability to go, okay, we didn't know that. I'll reflect on that and I'll incorporate that. Thanks for informing me. Whereas these pundits just scream and roar at you and double down on their position. And that's the difference. Yeah. I'm all for learning and moving and growing and educating myself because I know I'm wrong about more things than I'm right about. But it's this blind, dogmatic, bite down your mouthpiece, I will not move position that infuriates me. And it seems to be getting worse in today's world. And we actually have more information and we have more sources out there and we should be better informed to make decisions. But what's happened is with multiple information sources, people can't rationalize them. So they just get myopic and just go crazy down one route. And it's just, like you said, subdividing the whole world.
And repeating sound bites, you know, and regurgitating sound bites. And like, it's like this. And I think, again, they may very well be correct. Like, so when they say harsher sanctions, etc., they say we need, there needs to be, and there is some, of course, there's measures, but what people aren't still paying attention to is that we need to be really clear. So this might be an interesting one to start with. It's like, and this is the deepest question on the table at the moment, is the only way that we can guarantee, or at least get closest to guaranteeing peace, is total surrender. That's the closest possible way we can get to peace, is absolute just surrender. Because if we engage, so this is the question though. If we engage, why not surrender? Let's say. So then, if surrender is the main way to get closest to peace, then why not surrender? Well, you say so. Okay, so if we're afraid of lighting a spark, and what does that spark lead to? Well, mushroom clouds over European cities. Is that something that we're accepting as a possibility? Is that genuinely, is this worth fighting? And I'm not saying that it's not or it isn't. I'm saying, I'm literally trying to lay out the lay of the land here. If people of Ukraine, what are they fighting for? They're fighting for like independence, all the things you can hear Zelensky talk about, their ability to self-determine their leadership. It's not a perfect country. It has a load of problems with corruption. It has a murky history in loads of different domains. That's because it's a new young country that has.
Yeah, it's only 30 years old.
Yeah, it's a new young country that has all sorts of influences on it, and it's trying though, and it has had elections that managed to remove leaders peacefully and put new leaders in place. So it's attempting to become what we could call like a Western open society.
Yeah,
that's based on rule of law, the democratic capacity to remove political leaders with ballot paper rather than needing to use bullet shells, and an open press and free expression. So if we think about those fundamental Western values of open and fair elections where you can remove leaders peacefully, rule of law to basically put everyone to the same rules, regardless of where they are. And of course, that's never perfect, but it's the best we have because rich people can get better lawyers, etc. But at least in theory, it's there. And the third one is open expression, and free press, where you can openly criticize the government without getting black bagged in the middle of the night and fucking gulagged or brought out the back and put a bullet in the back of your head, which is the case for massive chunks of the world.
Oh, yes.
Maybe more people on earth live in that situation than don't.
Yeah.
You criticize the government, door gets kicked down in the middle of the night, black bag over your head, out the back, bullet in the back of your head. Or you get brought off and tortured, or you get made, you have video to have a forced confession.
So, Ciaran, when you say about surrender, are you inferring in your question that Ukraine surrenders or Russia surrenders? Like,
I'm saying
to the
if the attacking force. So let's say this.
Who's the attacker for the context?
This isn't me saying that we should. That I'm not saying anyone should. I'm saying that the question we need to be asking ourselves is because let's say let's say worst case scenario, 2 weeks time, Kiev is nothing but rubble and corpses because the Russians surround it. They give an ultimatum: surrender, or we're going to flatten the place. And then people go down into bunkers, and then the Russians decide to identify on GPS where all the entrances to all the subway stations are and cruise missile all the entrances and starve everyone to death because they can't get them with the missiles because they're too deep in the ground. So then it's basically 3 weeks time. You just have people buried underground who can't ever be gotten, and you have corpses and you have rubble. And this could very well be what happens in Kiev. They surround the place, starve it of resources, issue an ultimatum. Because they're not good, because they might, if they go in there and have a ground fight and start exchanging, the people in Kiev could very well have javelin missiles to take out tanks. They very well could have Molotov cocktails for troop vehicles. They can have snipers, they have weaponry. So then you're going to have a gunfight with thousands and thousands of armed civilians as well as military in Ukraine. And whereas like they might very well try that, get their arses handed to them a bit, decide it's not worth it, pull the troops out, surrender it, circle it, and flatten it if they don't surrender. So let's say that happens. And then eventually they do that with the whole of Ukraine. And then they have some stragglers in the countryside, but the whole thing is basically they have the country. And then they're at the border of NATO. And then they decide to continue expanding, let's say. And let's say because then NATO still don't want to respond because it's a non-NATO country. And then you're in a situation where they decide we want to keep this kind of expansionist mission going. Because the war machine now is building and all the sanctions have been taken as far as they possibly could. And people who've been protesting in Russia, but the protests are being crushed and people are being imprisoned and the supply chains are broken down and people are starting to get starved of food and medicine in Russia. And the military and the police are basically all afraid of their bosses all the way up the chain. And the communications have been taken down, so they can't organize a coup. They can't organize uprising because the internet's been shut down, taken down. People can't communicate, and this is in Russia. So then people are getting increasingly desperate, but they can't organize. They can't organize protests or anything like that because they keep getting maybe even shot at. Because that's what happened in Ukraine in 2014. Ukrainian people were shot at by their own army, or their own snipers that were put there by the president. So we have to take that and go, well, why? And let's say, but the Russian military, I'm just taking worst case scenario here. And then they decide to keep going and they decide we want to go north and we want to go to Romania. We want to go to Hungary. We want to go to Poland. We want to you just decide where they're going to go, or maybe start swallowing up some of the other smaller countries like Estonia up north. But you have to go, well, why? First of all, what are these people fighting for? They're fighting for the ability to have self-determined sovereignty, to not be subject to someone else's rule, because Russia isn't a democracy. And for whatever, that's not even looking at why they're even there, but let's say decide to go. It's like, are we legitimately willing? Maybe I'm trying to figure out a way of formulating this question, but the question comes down to, if the time comes, is our freedom and our ability to self-determine leadership and our ability to have open expression and our ability to operate in a society guided by rule of law and let's say, or our impulse, is that justified? Are we willing to genuinely start the war that could very well be the last war humanity ever fights in order to protect that? So this is the fundamental thing, is like, is it better to have freedom and fight for it in the hope of protecting it, but potentially end up losing all of the future of humanity? Or, because we've talked about these nuclear weapons a lot, like an all-out a nuclear war involving involving 1,000 weapons each, which is only a fraction of what they actually have from the West and the East, basically means that we end up with a new ice age, and it's below freezing temperatures even in the summer, and the world turns into a fucking snow globe. Or it turns into a snowball. The whole fucking earth, dark skies, snow around the earth. And apparently, like the Russians and America both have around 1,000 weapons ready to rock at any moment, and thousands more. So like, we have to okay, is it better? And this is the question we're really asking ourselves. Like when we have all these politicians talking about building defense budgets, etc., and buying more weapons and all this kind of stuff, it's like, okay, fair enough. Like, and they're probably, maybe they're right, but probably right. But the really deep fundamental question is the whole world ready to be Ukraine?
So let me start by answering this question.
Decision. The decision is surrender, and basically surrender to what perceived as like a tyrannical government that's not a dictatorship, or that's not a democracy, Russia. So it's surrender in the hope of peace, or keep fighting and risk total annihilation. Is freedom and hope of fighting and protecting freedom worth risking total annihilation of humanity? That's the question.
Right. So I've been thinking about this during the week. And so I agree with all the points you've made there. And they're interesting things. First of all, I think in a roundabout way, well, actually not a roundabout way, in an indirect way, the West is fighting a war in Ukraine. It's like a puppet war being played in Ukraine. It's the emergence of East versus West, Cold War II, Rocky IV, Drago, East versus West being played out on Ukrainian soil, but no NATO countries are in there. It's like getting a guy to wind up another kid on the playground to go over there and punch somebody else in the face and sitting back on, go on, throw a left hook. That's what's going on because nobody's gone in, right? That's first of all, I just want to say that. Now, I think you're right. For me, I think these are the following scenarios. I think 1, Putin takes Ukraine. 2, Putin takes Ukraine and then starts expanding into former Soviet countries. But some of those countries, like you mentioned, Estonia, Lithuania, Latvia, and Poland are part of NATO. So will he take over a smaller one and go, what are you going to fucking do now, NATO? Because the minute he crosses that line, is that going to trigger something? And if it doesn't, we're back now potentially in the 1930s as Hitler was starting to march into parts of Czech Republic, Austria, and so on. And he started taking up land. So we got very similar behaviors happening there. The other option is, like you said, Ukraine surrenders and goes, right, that's it. We're giving up. We're going to be Russian. Now, within Ukraine, we have to remember that predominantly, and this is generically and predominantly, again, we're not pundits, predominantly the east of that country will identify as Russian and the West won't, in general. And there's been data released showing that a number of people in the east, I think over 70%, don't want to join NATO, where it's the other way on the western side of the country. So we do have something of a bit of a divide within the country. So you got to beg the question and ask, will the peace talks, the second round, which is supposed to be happening soon, will we see a divided Ukraine? Where we'll see an East and a West Ukraine, a bit like we saw East and West Germany. We'll see a new Cold War frontier. This will be the new Berlin for us. I'm old enough to remember the Berlin Wall coming down when I was young. But will we see this coming up again, East versus West, East Ukraine versus West Ukraine, and East Ukraine providing a buffer basically between motherland Russia and the West Ukraine that will join NATO. That's or like we said, so you basically have Putin coming in and taking over, and expanding, or East versus West Ukraine happening in the future. I cannot see for the life of me Ukraine fighting back and keeping 100% independence in this, not unless NATO comes down like stormtroopers and takes over the whole place. And then we've got a bigger issue on our hands. We've got basically, a Cold War that becomes warm on a global scale. We're back into World War III then. That's the way I see these things playing out. And look, again, not a war pundit, but I just think there's going to be no benefit to this. And I'm just going to share a slide here, Ciaran, because this is some of my thinking. This is the NATO map here, which you can see. You can see that map, yeah?
Yeah.
And so the red there was promised invitation, which was basically the Ukraine promised invitation here for into NATO. And these are all the other NATO countries around here, as you can see. And so, you know, this is what we have to be aware of. This is happening. But what's happening as well at the moment as well, if we just take out, because predominantly in the West, it's this kind of like we're the good and the East is the bad. But let's just drop that for a moment and not think about good and bad sides of a war, because this is what scares me more than anything else. This sort of stuff scares me. This is a screen done from RT News on Instagram, and it was really interesting to watch this. So Joe Biden's coming out, branding Russia's Putin as a dictator and facing isolation. These guys should be talking him down off the ledge, not talking him up onto the next one. All they're doing is pushing him and pushing him and pushing him. Now, for anybody listening, if you're in a business context or a social context, if someone keeps pushing you, you're not going to go, all right, yeah, you won, you're the best, blah, blah. You're going to probably fucking fire back, right? You're not going to keep taking that. The more Biden antagonizes him from the opposite side of the planet, the worse this is going to be. These people need to be talking him down. And all these Western leaders, Biden, what's the fellow with the straw head's name in England? He's got a head like Boris Johnson. I always forget his name. I call him Straw Head because his head looks like straw. You got Straw Head. You've even got the Prime Minister here of Australia. Like, stop punishing and stop. You're just making it worse. You're just poking the bear. And then this other thing happens.
But there is. See that you say stop punishing, but like, if there comes a point where if there's no disincentive. So this is the messy, like, and I don't know what the solution is here, but what I'm not seeing is a genuine open confrontation by politicians with the question I just posed, which is basically saying along the lines of, we're imposing sanctions because we don't want to spark World War III, because we don't want to put boots in the ground, because we don't want to have World War III, because World War III is going to be the last war humans ever fight. And that's what, please stop this. Please come to the negotiation table, pause troop movements. We'll stop sending weapons in. If you pause your troop movements and stop your missile attacks, we'll just relax, please. We don't want to have to do this. And we don't want part of this. We do not want to fight. But you're backing us into a corner by doing this as well. So we don't want to back you into a corner. You don't back us into a corner. Let's just put the brakes on things and have a chat and see what we can do here.
But that's exactly what I'm saying. But it seems to be just inflammatory language.
But they're not. I think it's not just, because I have seen the likes of Boris has openly said, like, for example, when he was talking back against this notion of putting a no-fly zone over Ukraine. Like, I saw this, he has openly said that, look, this isn't something we can do and risk shooting down Russian fighter jets.
Yeah, I did hear that just on the news. No, yeah, and I thought that was actually good. Yeah,
yeah, they're in a really precarious situation. But like, any of the sanctions and any of the punishments that they're trying to bring, let's hope they're not punishments and more so disincentives, because the idea isn't to just try and humiliate someone and try and back them into a corner, and because then you back an injured animal into a corner, and it's when it's at its most dangerous.
Yeah, exactly.
At all times, there needs to be the provision of an off ramp. There needs to be the provision of a house, and it's like anything that's said. It's like, look, man. And if you're going to call someone a dictator, it needs to be very clearly as to why you're saying it. You're basically saying, look, I have no choice but to call you a dictator because any of your political opposition ends up dead or in prison. So this is what I'm calling you just by definition, because you're in a political situation where people can't get rid of you peacefully. So there needs to be like a genuine confrontation with what's going on. And this isn't happening. It's like, people are operating as if this is 1938 or 39, they're operating to a certain extent. I think, because I think if this was earlier, there is a reality to nuclear weapons that's putting the brakes on things as well. So it's not like Putin knows that. Like, he knows that, like, there may very well have been wars on Europe since 1945 if it wasn't for nuclear weapons, maybe there would have already been, the Cold War wouldn't have been cold if it wasn't for nuclear weapons keeping the reins back and pulling and keeping people back, because realize that if we do go here, this could be the end. Like, so there is a reality to nuclear weapons that puts a hold on things. But at the same time, if they're used at all, like, let me give you a scenario, right? For example, this is like a really blunt introduction to nuclear game theory, where, let's say I'm in the West and I'm in France or UK, where they're the two nuclear armed states that are in Europe, France and UK. And the other countries are like the US, France, UK, Russia, North Korea, India, Pakistan, China, Israel, and Iran. Israel is kind of like strategic ambiguity. We're not going to mind your fucking business. We're not going to tell you, I think. And then Iran maybe is on the way to having them as well, right? But in Europe, it's France and England. So let's say nukes are on the way, right? And it comes up on the screen, nukes on the way. They're going to get here in 7 or 8 minutes. And let's say there's 200 nukes going to France, or there's 100 going to France, and there's 50 going to the UK, and they're targeting all the military installations and launch platforms and everything. And their thing is, okay, do we actually push the return fire button? Because if you know that there's enough on the way that humanity might still survive, but if I retaliate, they probably won't. Do you still push the button and get rid of Russia, or get rid of the attack sites in Russia, the ground-based missiles, and maybe even cities, if some of them are near cities? Like that's an introduction to nuclear game theory right there. Is like, if the missiles are on the way and there's enough coming that you're worried that this might put the future of humanity at risk, but if I do push the button, the future of humanity is definitely at risk, the whole lot of it, because of nuclear winter, independent of any of the fallout that we've talked about, or the nuclear winter that we talked about before, where the sky goes dark. That's the question. So like, when you take it like that, you go, if Putin gets backed into enough of a corner and he starts to feel embarrassed, or he starts to feel humiliated, and politicians and journalists are constantly going on about how he's failing and how his army looks weak, and he's starting to feel, and he's going to get pressured and isolated, and a coup could happen, and all this kind of stuff, and they start being just pundits just trying to do this stuff, then you wonder, at what point would he not just, and especially if the Russian populace is already against him, if there's protests already, if he's already put, like I saw a video last night of a 77-year-old woman being arrested at a protest, an anti-nuclear protest, an anti-war protest, and she's holding posters, 77, frail little old lady getting led away in Russia. Why not put a mushroom cloud over Berlin and say, fuck off, mind your business? Because you're then forcing their hand, and you're saying, I'm ready to use these weapons. Are you ready to fucking use them?
Well, Ciaran, I think that's exactly, I'm completely aligned with you on that, because that's exactly my thoughts, is that, and that's my point about Biden. You keep pushing him and you keep pushing him, you will fucking get him to push the button. Because I don't think that Putin's not going to be embarrassed. I can't see Putin stopping this war now on a global scale. I can't see it. It's not like Crimea, where it was in a small region and where most people identified as Russian, probably over 80%, or wanted to be. That it's not like that. We've got a full-scale invasion happening here. There is no scenario in my head where I see Putin marching back, unless NATO goes in and goes full force, and then it's World War III, and then it's even worse. But I can't see Putin retreating back to the Kremlin and going, well, that was a bit of fun, lads, a few weeks, but you know what? We learned our lessons, and we'll just go back onto how it was. I don't think that's going to happen.
But and this is the what do they call it? The fog of war, like, you know. There's a poem, WB Yeats, The Second Coming, that I've been thinking of a lot recently. I'm going to get it up, but here we are. But there's a line, actually, right? This is a quote I came across recently from a Russian journalist who's from a state. His name is Dmitry Kiselyov. And he was a journalist appointed by Putin to a Russian state-run news agency. So this is a quote from him. He said, "Our submarines can shoot more than 500 nuclear warheads. This would guarantee destruction of the USA and all other NATO countries. In accordance with the principle, why do we need the world if Russia isn't there? Russia's nuclear arms are delivered by the world's fastest strategic bombers. That's without even mentioning Russian strategic missile forces. The Russian nuclear potential is the strongest in the world. Today, our Russian nuclear triad is on the high alert. Putin did warn the West, do not try to scare Russia." So when you think about that, why do we need the world if Russia isn't there? So if you already have that kind of rhetoric coming from media voices, state-run media voices, is of course the chance that it's just, barking and not serious, but on the chance that this is some kind of we have to think from a Western perspective, from our perspective in the West. And by what I mean the West is you just break it down to open societies, like democratic open societies that are in the European Union, NATO, plus you look at South Korea, Japan, and Australia, New Zealand, as well as the actual geographic West.
Yeah.
And then you go, well, in that kind of scenario, from our perspective, we might very well be operating from a place of kind of logic and humanistic values, where we're universalists in terms of human rights. We might very well have patriotic impulses or patriotic feelings toward our countries and pride for our cultural histories, etc., in certain ways. But antithetical to Western values is a notion that I'm better than you by virtue of where I'm born. But that's a new phenomenon in human history, really. It's relatively new, where we're evolutionarily we're tribal, and also we're set up to be able to believe stories, and that we're these. So when you look at the way that if there's the same way that you might very well have with the kind of like Hitler had this thing where he had this bizarre mythology around the specialness of the German blonde beast, the kind of the German Aryan race thing. Yeah. There's a special fucking destiny for us, and there's a special destiny written into fucking the cosmos for the specialness of our race. That this cosmic justice way of thinking about your country and the people of your country. And the kind of whether he believes it or not, maybe it's just propaganda, maybe he doesn't, but the kind of rhetoric that comes from Putin sometimes is based around the specialness of Russian traditional values and the specialness of Russia and specialness of Russian people. And I'm not trying to call Putin Hitler, because the word Hitler gets tossed around to anyone from fucking J.K. Rowling, who's apparently a transphobe, by fucking Justin Trudeau was calling the anti-vaccine mandate, the anti-mandate protesters in Ottawa, he was calling them Nazis, even though they just simply didn't want to have to be told to get a vaccine to go to work when they live in a truck by themselves. And they were protesting, and apparently they were Nazis, because just the word Hitler and gets tossed around now in the kind of post-World War II block, but it gets tossed around as the touchstone for evil in a secular world. So in a secular world where post-Nietzschean God is dead world, where we've abandoned religion, the word Hitler and Nazis, they're just standing now for the devil and his demonic forces. It's just become a new thing because people aren't willing to use religious language anymore. But there is a reality to at least the rhetoric. So when you read that kind of a quote from a state media voice, it's what's the point of the world if Russia isn't there? So if there's even a chance that that's actually the possibility, how many of us in the West are willing to go, okay, what's the point of the world if freedom and self-determination isn't there? Is that something that we're willing to defend? Because we're not operating from a place of patriotic superiority in terms of explicit Western values. That's antithetical. Like tribalism is antithetical to universal humanistic values. That
so
like
can we just
the UN Convention of Human Rights, etc.
So what you're saying there, Ciaran, is because people have got so tribalistic over the last few years with this constant division of community and humanity, that basically people won't feel as nationalistic going forward. So, for example, in the West, it's often been said at the moment that, you know, with Putin going into Ukraine, and this was probably just like tongue in cheek, that people were saying that the West was so, you know, crazy about diversity, inclusion and equity and transgender pronouns and, you know, wearing your tracksuit to work on Friday and all these type of things, that we just kind of, we're completely divided. So we've got these tribal groups happening. Therefore, we don't believe in a nation or a national identity anymore. Is that correct?
But I think it's even not only just a national identity, but I think it's maybe a separate point. But I'm not advocating for anything that resembles nationalistic superiority, because that to me would be like, it's like, I don't think someone is special by virtue of where they were born. I think I'm not special because I was born in Ireland, but that doesn't mean that I can't feel a sense of belonging and love for people that are also from Ireland because we share a cultural history.
Yeah.
So there's a difference between me feeling superior to someone from another country, or me thinking that Irish people are superior to someone else, or me disdaining someone because they're from another country, versus me being. So there's a kind of almost a difference between nationalism and patriotism. If you look at nationalism and how it's often used, is we're special because we are, whatever, German, Russian, British, Irish.
So that could be very easily explained as superiority versus commonality.
Yeah, that's a really good way of putting it. Yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas, so I think the Western, I think what I've been grappling with is, and this is a legitimate question, if we, let's say Taiwan is in the same situation, let's say we have this rise, two of them, like you look at China, for example, and Russia, and you look at these two countries that are, China for much longer, because Russia was kind of in the background, because it genuinely has been a small, it certainly has had a relatively small impact considering the size of the country and considering how many weapons they have. As long as they weren't involved in military situations, China, like Russia is an economy that I think is smaller than Italy's economy or something. Like it's a small country. It's 140 million people, but it's got a very small economy. It's like, it's not a great, but so much of the spending goes on the military. And I had this, it's almost like Russia has been like a boxer that's been training and got a glimpse of a couple of fights. They went and did proxy war stuff in Syria. They went and did, so they had to go off Crimea. They attacked Georgia in 2008. They had tastes. But in the meantime, they were almost like sparring sessions, basically, where they got a chance to go out, go to other clubs and practice their skills. And then go back to the gym, rebuild. A few smokers. And this is their chance now. So like, it's almost like, and I'm not talking about the Russian people. I'm talking about the decision makers that are in charge of the army and everything. Because the Russian people, like, how can you take these young lads now? And it's a different, I'm not going to go there, but so I think the real question that's at play that's not being addressed is because if surrender to China, if they're willing to use nukes and we're not, or even if we are we genuinely aware of what the cost of doing so is? Because are we willing, as a free world, let's say, to use the cliche, but it's true, it's like the free world being parts of the world that are actually governed by rule of law with freedom of press and open democratic elections where leaders can be removed without needing to spill blood. Are we genuinely willing to make moves that ends the entirety of human civilization, so that we can protect the open society. So is freedom worth the risk of annihilation? That's the question that Ukrainian people have been asking themselves for years now, but it's what they've stood up to do in the last 7 days, 10 days, when there's been a few weeks when the troops started amassing. And it's what they're living out now, where civilians who've never been in the army in their life have put down their keyboards, put down their shovels, and picked up Kalashnikovs and Molotov cocktails and been trained how to use fucking javelin weapons to take tanks out. And they're now in the situation where, to them, freedom, the hope of freedom, is better than the promise of slavery. Well, and this is a situation that we need to, the hope of freedom, the risk of annihilation is worth the risk of, is better than surrendering and becoming a subject to someone else that you don't give up your opportunity for freedom and sovereignty. So that's the question that we're all asking. Like,
let's look at that side of the ledger then, because as you said there, you've got people taking up arms who have never been in the military before, and then you've got people like your old boxing mate here, Lomachenko, who is now donning a uniform and patrolling the streets and doing what he has to do, as is the old former heavyweight champ there, Klitschko, as well, and his brother. And so one of the Klitschko's there holds, obviously, he's the mayor of Kiev, but these guys have stood up and put on a uniform. Now, there's two parts to this, Ciaran, I find, is that one is that it makes me, extremely proud is not the right word, but I'm extremely surprised that people will stand up in this day and age, particularly people in the people of wealth, people of high profile positions, because I don't think that would happen in the US. I don't think people like that would go to war. You did see Teddy Roosevelt, who was the president in the US back in the late 1800s, early 1900s, Teddy Roosevelt, he was a bit of a crazy bastard. He went off. He was the undersecretary for the Navy, and he went off and fought in the Cuban War as part of the American-Spanish war that was happening. So he fought in Cuba and then came back. But he also trained like judo and boxing in the Oval Office when he was president. He was mental. But those type of people don't really exist anymore, where these people would do it. So when I see that happen, I'm like,
there's also to make a historical difference with them. I think, to my understanding of Teddy Roosevelt, I wonder how much of that with him was a kind of an idealistic notion of wanting to go to war and wanting to prove his masculinity, because he
100%.
Whereas these lads,
so
these are world champion boxers. These are millionaires.
That's exactly what I was going to say, Ciaran. That was exactly what I was going to go with it. Teddy Roosevelt, as an example, like I've read a couple of his biographies by Thomas Edmund. There's 3 books. I've read 2 of them. And I think you're right. I think he wanted to go and prove himself. He wanted to do that, where these guys don't. So what makes a multimillionaire in a privileged position stand up? And I tell you, Ciaran, it can only be for the want of, he wants to fight, and he wants to defend his country, and he believes in what Ukraine is. Because if that country was super tribalistic and they were all worried about division, people like Klitschko and Lomachenko wouldn't be putting on a uniform and doing this. People wouldn't be going out onto the street building barriers in front of nuclear power plants that happened yesterday on the road down to the nuclear power plant because they want the Russians to take it over. People wouldn't be going out on the street making Molotov cocktails. You had the former prime minister of Ukraine showing people how to make Molotov cocktails on a YouTube video the other day. Like, I don't think that would happen. Now, is that good or bad? I don't know. But you got to respect them, because I think in a lot of Western countries, they would send people to do their fighting, and a lot of the people in privileged positions, you want to call it that, or administrative positions, wouldn't even get out of their fucking suit to put on a tracksuit. So these guys are actually getting up and doing something. So I find I have to admire them for that. But will that be to their detriment? I don't know.
Like, it's not going to be surprising, unfortunately. And this is what's so fucking deeply sad, is like that these are people that I've grown up admiring, like Klitschko's and Usyk. Like, I'm watching Usyk box since 2011, and Jan Lomachenko as well in the 2011 World Championships when they were and Lomachenko here in the picture. And I've watched these 2 boys box since 2011. I've been watching the Klitschko since I was a young fella. And there's a reality there's a stark reality here where there's quite a high chance they won't be alive at the end of the week or next week. Yeah. And they'll have died. There's just, and the amount of human suffering that's taken place because of just ideas, just people have certain ideas in the command positions of the Russian government, particularly from what it sounds like, Putin has this notion of Russian superiority and not even just Russian as in the geographical country of Russia as it is. It's the Rus people, like some kind of the roots, whatever his mythology is around the roots of the people that formulated the historic region, or that part of the region. There's kind of like I started a book recently by this guy Gary Laughlin, and in it he described, it's from a few years ago, it was published. I started it this week, and what he mentions in it is that this region, basically the mythology around this region stretches from Vladivostok to Dublin, is what he said. It's a specific line in it. He says the empire stretches the ethnographic roots of this region are from Vladivostok to Dublin.
Now, to give that context, Vladivostok, or whatever you call it, is basically nearly in Alaska.
Yeah. So that's
about 11 or 12 time zones.
Yeah. And this book, I can't remember the title of, I guess I get the title of this book because I listened to a really interesting podcast that kind of provided an interesting religious lens on this. And it was from, we can include a link to this in it below, but it was from Rebel Wisdom was the name of the podcast. We've listened to that a lot. And this book is called The Return of Holy Russia, Apocalyptic History, Mystical Awakening, and the Struggle for the Soul of the World by Gary Lackman. So it's really interesting. It provides an interesting religious lens on this.
Is it Lackman, L-A-C-K or
L-A-C-H?
L-A-C-H-M-A-N?
Yeah. It's on. I started listening to it on Audible. As soon as I finished that podcast, I went on and got the book on Audible. It's fascinating. But this is the thing, and this is the question we're actually asking. So, like when you look at what's going on, like the Ukraine, the people of Ukraine are a kind of a microcosm, canary in the coal mine for totalitarian or authoritarian expansion. And it's not just from, and unfortunately, the West has done a lot to undermine its own values. You know, it's on a mind. It's like the fact that, for example, we in the European Union now aren't going to be able to watch Russia Today being broadcast because it's a state news channel, because they were afraid of quote unquote disinformation or misinformation and propaganda. But I'm like, okay, but that didn't influence how Putin rolled into Ukraine, the fact that Russia Today was on. So how can we in the West defend an open press and the free expression of opinion and information if we are not willing to say our society is robust enough and they trust us enough that we're willing to allow you to broadcast whatever propaganda you want and it's grand? Like, the fact that we're not willing to do that is an indictment on us. It's an indictment on the trust that our politicians have in our populace. They think that, we can't take the risk that this Russian propaganda, disinformation, whatever, we can't take the risk that they're going to think that they're going to get brainwashed and they're going to be against our efforts to support Ukraine or whatever. The fact that they're not willing to do that, first of all, is an indictment on them in terms of their trust of us as a populace, that they don't trust us to be able to watch propaganda and not get brainwashed. And the second thing is, how can we criticize the Russian suppression of journalism in the country, the governmental suppression of journalists in the country that are not following the government line, that are independent journalistic outlets, and journalists that are not towing the party line and are getting shut down and are getting arrested and are getting, how can we criticize that if we can't let them broadcast their stuff on our airwaves?
We do the same thing, Ciaran. We've done the same thing for 2 years around COVID. And then we have this moral justification that the bad information's come from here. This comes back to what I said at the start. There's this good versus evil. And people are looking through this as
it's not only just good versus evil, it's even more arrogant than that. It's not even just good versus evil. It's we know the truth and you don't. And what we say is
exactly. Yeah.
It's like we are the high priests of truth, and you're going to pray and worship at the church of our God-given omniscience.
Yeah.
It's like this arrogant, and this is just an irrelevant. Like people are cheering. It's, take down Russia today. It's propaganda, and I'm like, the fucking precedent that this is setting for if there is a future after this is all over. The fact that media outlets are being shut down by us or being blocked by us, and social media blocking it. Like Google said, it's going to shut down RT as well, like Russia Today. And I'm like, this isn't a good thing. Like, I don't see how this is. They should be allowed to. China and Russia and any other country that doesn't like Western open democracies, they should be allowed to broadcast. Do say whatever you want. Broadcast anything. And we're going to lead by example, because we're going to operate with straightforwardness and honesty and truth, such that we're going to help equip our populace with critical thinking capacities, so that it doesn't matter what you show them. We trust them to formulate opinions about the world, because we also are going to hold our media accountable. If they say bullshit, we're not going to ban them, but we're going to call them out, and we're going to call each other out for lying. We're going to call each other out for inflaming things. So if that was where we were operating from, but instead we're operating from a place, then we could then criticize China for imprisoning and disappearing journalists who tried to talk about the COVID pandemic very early on, who are now still maybe disappeared, for suppressing whistleblowers like Dr. Li Wenliang, who's dead now, or Dr. I Fen, who disappeared for months and then eventually had some fucking post to say that I'm grand, don't worry about me, I'm back at work. Because these are people who tried to blow the whistle about the COVID pandemic in January and February of 2020, or January of 2020. So like, we cannot criticize dictatorial governmental situations for crushing critique or dissent or alternative viewpoints to the government party line if we ourselves are doing it as well. So that's something that we need to be very careful of, because we're undermining our own values in that sense. So we need to. So our threats to our freedom aren't just from the outside. It's like, if we give a shit about freedom of expression, open inquiry, and then that's the foundation, that's the lifeblood, that's the soil, that's the fertile soil for open liberal democracy. And
Ciaran, I believe we are becoming the snake that's eating its own tail in a negative way, because what you've said there is really interesting, because we've been doing that. In the COVID pandemic, we've been shutting down sources of information, right? And we've said it was fake news, it was lies, it was this, it was that. People were deplatformed. And then all of a sudden, it came out that it was true. And nobody got an apology.
But prime examples of this being Google shutting down or removing Senate testimony from, I believe, I can't remember the guy's name, Kyle Carpenter, I think was his name, and other people who had vaccine-induced injury.
Yeah.
And pericarditis, myocarditis. And now the data is out that actually myocarditis risk is, what is it, like 133 times more likely to occur from the vaccine if you're a young fella than from the virus itself.
Yeah.
So, and this isn't to say that there is other complexities to it and that there's other benefits to the vaccine, but the fact that this was suppressed and that people weren't making, as a result, people who were in countries that didn't have mandates, or people who had mandates had to just do what they were told or else get fined or else not be allowed to go to work, etc. But the fact that people weren't making informed decisions, because anything that went against the party line or made the decisions or made the what would you say, the rhetoric around the vaccine safety, anything that questioned that at all was seen was just, that's misinformation, cancel, suppress, censor. Then that feeds distrust. So like Facebook banned or started shadow banning a British Medical Journal article that was about Pfizer malpractice and Pfizer vaccine trials. And it's a British Medical Journal investigative piece, and they were shadow banning it. Up to the May 27th of this year, Facebook had banned the sharing of lab leak related content.
Yep.
And that was deemed to be okay, as if, even though they're genuine scientific questions, like so the fact that.
So not only I think that are we eating our own tail? The COVID pandemic is a classic example of that. And no matter what side of the fence you sat on, pro vaccine, pro mandates, pro enforcement, anti this, anti that, it doesn't matter. We've seen it happen on both sides. We've also seen as well, played out on a micro stage, is what happened, what you spoke about there, Ciaran, in Ottawa with the truckers. Canada, one of the most liberal, open, socially democratic countries in the world. And what happened in Ottawa was fucking scary to me. That people peacefully protested. And I tell you, man, I've got so much admiration for those truckers. They were overly the top, using, I would say, the words love and compassion even towards the police. And they still got taken down like that. And then Trudeau going into hiding, running around, basically calling these people Nazis, like you said, saying that they were right-wing extremists and so on and so on. He wouldn't even go down. He wouldn't even go down and speak to them, right? And this is exactly the problem that's happening at the moment. The other day at that UN Council, just to bring it back to the Ukraine crisis, diplomats walked out on Lavrov. So he's a Russian guy that was Sergei Lavrov was speaking at the UN Human Rights Forum. Now, before that, the president of Ukraine was speaking and he got a standing ovation. This guy speaks and everybody walks out the door. Now, regardless whether you are on the Russian side or the Ukraine side, or you don't give a fuck, or you think everything's crazy, walking out on people, right, or not engaging in conversation is not the way to go. These are world leaders. These are people on the world stage. They should be engaging, listening, even if you don't like it. Let's hear it so we can counter bad speech or improper speech with good speech. We can counter bad ideas or misinformed ideas with good ideas. If we know where you're coming from, we can have a shared space. But at the moment, I think that some of these people in the UN Human Rights Forum, they're acting like petulant kids walking out. Like, you need to sit there and listen to what's going on from everybody. You're not paid there to walk out the fucking door. And the same as the guy in Ottawa, that Trudeau. He's an asshole. He should have went down there. If he went down there and shook people's hands, he would have been a hero and spoke to them. He didn't have to give them what they want, but he could have at least spoke.
But I think it's really important.
He ran off and he like a fucking coward. Multiple countries and multiple states. And this is the problem. Nobody has got any spine or backbone or can actually go and speak to people. I'm not saying people have to be aggressive, but you need to have some character and you need to engage. You need to listen to both sides or all sides. This kind of just shutting people down straight away is just unbelievable, man. That scares me more than anything else.
I think what's really important to clarify there is that we're not by any stretch of the imagination. I see where you're coming from, but we're not conflating Lavrov with the truckers because they're on different planets.
Oh, 100%. I'm just seeing all these different examples that are happening. I'm not condoning anybody.
It's the unwillingness to engage in discourse because
yes,
and I'd agree. It's like this is something that's what people think reminding themselves of as well is that this is like the latest. You have to think where people are virtue signaling, where it's easy for people to jump on board and gang up on someone when they feel like they're going to get supported by their mates.
Yeah.
But where was this when China swallowed Hong Kong? Where was this when China wouldn't allow an open, international, impartial investigation into the origins of the COVID-19 pandemic in Wuhan? Yeah. So where is this when, and they're international related issues. The Hong Kong issue is an international issue, even though it's the secondary territory of China and all that, but it is an international issue because it was the breaking of an international agreement with the UK signed in 1997. That it was supposed to be its own place until 2000 for 50 years, until whatever year that was going to be, 2047. So this is the thing. It's like, it's all very well and good for these politicians to be virtue signaling now. And the thing is, maybe it's possible that they were even right to do that because they were about to get propagandaed and weren't able. But there's the possibility also that they were wrong to do that. And we can't applaud what that was just on principle of because they weren't willing to listen and weren't willing to talk and were willing to shut Russia out. So like, because there's two ways to solve conflict, and that's discourse or violence.
Yes,
two
exactly.
Ways. Discourse or violence. That's it. Two options.
But they're choosing violence by walking out there, Ciaran, by virtue of their action.
And they're not leading. And we have to use the Gandhi line: be the change. So like we have to be the change that we want to see in the world. And that means leading by example, having the most difficult of difficult conversations.
Yeah.
It means actually living up to our own values. As if we don't do that, then how can we possibly judge someone else for not doing it? So it's like, in this sense, it's like, and to use and go back to Trudeau, it went even further with Trudeau, unfortunately, which is worrying again if there is a future after this next few weeks or next few months. The precedent he set by going after protesters, not only by forcibly removing their trucks or whatever, or trying to get the police in and calling them Nazis, but freezing their bank accounts, seizing the crowdfunding, there was like 10 million quid or something raised by crowdfunding GoFundMe, and they froze that and wouldn't give it to them. So like, this is like big tech censorship, and people are applauding it. Hey, nice, you're censoring misinformation. And it's like, there's all this kind of shit, but then that's a slippery slope. And what that leads to is eventually big tech on the side of who runs the bank accounts, who runs the electric banking.
Yeah.
So now you're going to stop people from being able to partake in the economy because of their political opinion and their peaceful protesting. And where was this kind of, so like, how can we in the West, and these politicians, some of these politicians might very well have criticized, I don't know, but some of these politicians at this human rights forum might very well have posted on social media, virtue signaling about Russia and arresting protesters, etc. But where were they last week, 2 weeks ago, when Justin Trudeau initiated emergency fucking wartime emergency laws to be able to freeze people's bank accounts and because they were protesting against his mandate, and he throws the toys out of the pram? How he's shutting down protests over there? How can that are peaceful protests about vaccine mandates? Where were they in criticizing him then? So like, this is the thing, is like, if we genuinely, this is what makes me think it's like, maybe the solution, maybe our society wouldn't decide to protect its freedoms and its sovereignty and its ability to have self-determination and operate by rule of law. And maybe our society wouldn't choose it. Maybe our society would rather just decide they're bad guys over there, these Nazi people, and they should just get whatever punishment is coming to them because our politicians said that they're the bad guys. In terms of within our society,
that's what's happening. Yeah,
we're not willing to live up to our own values and disagree with people and allow people. Like there's an old line, and it's like Evelyn Beatrice Hall was this writer. She paraphrased Voltaire in this quote where she said something along the lines of. I may disagree what you are saying, but I'll fight to the death to protect your ability to voice your opinion.
Yeah.
That's what freedom of expression is. It's not, I get to say what I want. It's, I'm willing to protect your ability to say what you want, even though I disagree with you. That's what it actually means at a fundamental level, is that we're willing to hold disagreement, and we're willing to engage with disagreement, and we're willing to accept other people will disagree with us, because that's what allows us to voice our opinions. So in this,
but see, Ciaran, this is interesting on this. Let's just follow the same thread for a second, because here's another one I brought up as well, because you alluded to it about China. This was in the paper yesterday in Australia. It was called a wake-up call for Australia on China risk. If China waged war in the Taiwan Strait, would Australia be willing to suffer massive economic pain against Beijing? The consequences would most likely be mass unemployment, business failure, stock market meltdown, smashed superannuation like retirement funds, huge government budget deficits, and social dislocation. Because at the moment, Ciaran, the Ukraine crisis is actually going to benefit Australia. And the reason it's going to benefit Australia is because we export gas from here. So we're going to get more money for gas. Now, that's from a business perspective. However, the numpties of the country, like me, we're going to feel it because our petrol prices have gone up, I don't know, from $1.50 a litre to about $2 a litre. I presume it's the same in Ireland as well. And in addition to that, the cost of our goods during COVID, and because we have supply chain issues and because of isolations and so on, the average price of my shopping has gone up about 20% a week, right? So what's going to happen now is with the Ukraine crisis as well, there's going to be more increases because of shipping. So all the negative effects will be passed down to the middle class and working class, whilst all the big businesses and upper class people are going to make a fucking bomb. Sorry, a bomb. Not make a bomb. I should make a bomb like a lot of money. I shouldn't have said a bomb, but make a lot of money. But what happens now if China does this in Taiwan? Will Australia postulate the same way that America is to Russia?
But here's another one. Even like, why shouldn't the Chinese government put a mushroom cloud over where Sydney used to be and roll the country up like a kebab?
The only reason at the moment is, Ciaran, because we basically feed them iron ore, some coal.
But that'll be
gas,
their iron ore.
That's all.
But that'll be their iron ore then.
Oh, like, I think if China wanted to invade here, they could in 2 weeks. I think we will be raising the Chinese flag here in 2 weeks if they wanted to.
Yeah, and that's why shouldn't they? Like, because there is a reality to like there is a reality to war that's just we can't ignore it. It's like if China at the moment are kind of standing back and they're kind of like watching from the sidelines and they're not fully on board, but they're not against, and they're abstaining. They're abstaining and they're like watching to see, they're not getting engaged because Russia, we don't know what's going on. They might fucking lose here, or maybe if they win, we'll see what the crack is. We're going to watch what NATO does because we're keeping an eye on Taiwan because we want to swallow that place up. So they're kind of watching, but in terms of resources and everything, and I know obviously there'd be huge economic backlash, but the Chinese government, just like the Russian government, don't give a bollocks about their population. They don't give a shit because they can't get removed. They have a dictatorship. They control. China's way more of a dictatorship than Russia because China doesn't have access to Facebook. China doesn't have access to external internet. China has monitoring services so that they're tracking everything that their population does on the internet. Like this is the thing about tyranny nowadays, dictatorial situations nowadays, have technology to monitor its populace that George Orwell couldn't have dreamed of.
Oh yeah.
We have like imagine what the Gestapo or the 1940s, 1950s Cheka, like the KGB would have been able to do with our modern technological algorithms and our modern services. They would have had informers handing them pieces of paper, telling them what the neighbors were doing. And then how do they collate all this information? But now they can just watch whatever you do. They can watch whatever you buy. They can read every message you send. So the ability, and they can track wherever you go with GPS in your phone. Like, it's like,
yeah.
This is the thing about, if this is one of the ways that humanity's future can get lost. Is humanity's future gets lost through a locked-in totalitarian dictatorship scenarios. And by locked in, I mean, because you have no way of initiating uprisings or organizing yourselves because you have no way of communicating without the government seeing what you're doing. Whereas before, there would have at least been the ability to meet secretly or to be able to go but because there wouldn't have been cameras everywhere and microphones in our phones that are listening to everything we're saying for advertising purposes. And this makes me seem like a conspiracy theorist, but it's not. It's just the technology that we have. So
it's not a theory. It's actually happening.
It's happening. And this is the actual, like the fundamental, if totalitarian systems, this is why I'm so sensitive to these suppressions and censorship of freedom of expression, of dissenting opinion, of quote unquote misinformation, my most hated word in the English fucking language. because it's just a word it means nothing. Like the misinformation means nothing. The same reason that Nazi or Hitler doesn't mean anything anymore. It's boy who cried wolf. It's used so often. It's watered down. It doesn't mean anything. It means misinformation means so little now, and it's been used in such horrendous circumstances to basically point towards things that the people in positions of influence don't like the lab leak hypothesis, for example. That it ends up being almost an indication that when I hear someone is spreading misinformation, that's almost an indication that person has something interesting to say that might be of use. Because the boy who's cried wolf so often to just describe things that politicians or the kind of the mainstream media or tech platforms have fucked up on and called like there's only so often you can call Joe Rogan a Nazi or Jordan Peterson a Nazi or J.K. Rowling a Nazi, where the word Nazi now becomes worth nothing as a label. And it's actually just an indication that, this person might actually have something interesting to say. So that's just a little bit of a tangent there. But when it comes to the fundamental existential risk questions, there's three ways that humanity's future potential can get destroyed. One, complete extinction. There is no humans, so there is no future. Two, partial extinction or partial annihilation. I know you can only be kind of pregnant. You can't be kind of pregnant. You can't be kind of annihilated. But basically, let's say hundreds of millions or billions die, civilization collapses, and we're in Mad Max world. And very few of us know how to provide for ourselves in the absence of global supply chains and food, etc. And then you're just scavenging for food, and you're just trying to just catch birds and shit, set traps, and fucking scrambling for calories. And the third way it can happen is locked in totalitarian dictatorship. That's a techno dictatorship that you can't get out of because you're being monitored constantly. So there's no way of organizing a revolt or revolution. And you end up with like dictatorial scenarios where everyone is keeping the show on the road because they're all afraid of being gulagged. Every level up the command chain, like in China, for example, or Saudi Arabia. Or way worse versions of that as tech gets better. So these are the three ways in which the humanity's future potential can get destroyed: complete annihilation, Mad Max world, or locked in techno dictatorship. So when it comes to and to bring it back to maybe this another way of phrasing it, it's like, which do we want? It is the protection of humanity's future potential in terms of our ability to self-determine, to make decisions, to express ourselves openly, to choose our leaders. Is that worth protecting against? Are we willing to fight against the potential for locked-in techno-dictatorship such that we're willing to risk a Mad Max world or total annihilation? So we have to pick our own poison now. That's the fundamental philosophical question at play here. Is it better to risk Mad Max world or total annihilation in order to stop locked-in dictatorships? Because that's what's happening. That's what's playing out. That's what the Ukrainian people are choosing to do today. They're choosing their decision was, fuck you. We're ready to die here in the protection of the hope of having an open society and protecting an open society with rule of law, freedom of expression, and an open, fair, democratic elections. That's what they're doing. But how many of us in the rest of the Western world are willing to are on board with that? Because what their microcosmic example is, which is we'd rather risk annihilation over tyranny. Are we willing to do the same? And by annihilation, this time, we're making that decision on behalf of the whole world, because nuclear weaponry doesn't have localized consequences. Once they're used, people in all over the world are going to starve to death, not just wherever the weapons were used. It's people in Africa, people in South America who had nothing got to do with this war are going to starve to death because of weapons that are fired in Europe.
Now, Ciaran, people in the environmental community would say the same thing about, well, if China is emitting X amount of CO2, it's going to affect other parts of the world. Well, guess what? If nuclear weapons goes off, like you said, it's going to fucking really affect you more so than this.
Tomorrow.
Yeah, it's instant. It's a payback period of like minus 10 seconds.
And this is the thing. And this is part of where we need to be wary of this kind of virtue signaling stuff on behalf of our politicians and everything, is that they fucked up for so many years, jumping up and down, putting all their eggs in the climate change basket while functionally ignoring sudden global cooling. So they've basically put all these eggs in this gradual global warming basket because it's been politically convenient, because the consequences are far away, because it fits with our failed intuitions that view history as this linear thing that tips along. Whereas that's not how history works, but that's how we think about it. History works in a much more chaotic manner where very little happens and then a huge event happens that changes things. Very little happens and then a huge event happens that changes things. That's how history works. It's like it tips along, jumps, tips along, jumps. And our intuitions have failed us already. Our political leaders have failed us already so often that we need to be really wary when they start virtue signaling and acting the hard man in front of podiums. And because we've seen them fail on defund the police, we've seen them fail on supporting, like, for example, even on things like Trump, let's say. I'm even no fan of Donald Trump, but any more than I'm a fan of Biden, to be honest. But Trump was banned from Twitter, but Putin, as far as I know, as of yesterday, still had a Twitter account.
So does Al-Qaeda. So does the Taliban.
Yeah, and ISIS.
Yeah.
And the Saudi Arabian government, as far as I know, and the Chinese Communist Party. So the hypocrisy is overwhelming to us in some ways. And it's like either we ourselves live in accordance with our own values, or we just let not even tyranny come from outside, but just creep along from within because of ridiculously naive hate speech laws, because of protesters like they brought in here in Ireland. I don't know what the consequences are going to be, or protesters having their bank accounts frozen in Canada, or anti-mandate protesters in Austria. People being out protesting because they're like, even at times where the mandates are still brought in, even though the Omicron is no more fucking dangerous than a flu, according to people who are actually pro-vaccine, but are like, well, actually, like I've been fucking vaccinated, but I was vaccinated back in a time when it was the much more dangerous versions of the virus. But that's for someone to be vaccinated now is a different question. But that was kind of conveniently not touched on by countries that are introducing mandates, because the virus is fucking different now than it was. And that's being ignored by people who are still finding it a useful political agenda to push and control its populace and act like they're fucking saviors trying to protect their little sheep herd.
Western Australia.
Yeah.
So always done is to delay the inevitable.
Yeah, that one was for you there in particular. I kind of, my mind started going.
Don't get me fucking started on it.
Yeah. So this is that to me is the deep. That's the deep question there, man. Like, is the protection of self-determination, freedom, independence, freedom of viewpoint expression and inquiry, open and fair elections, is that worth the Mad Max world, risking a Mad Max world or total annihilation? That's the question that NATO needs to ask it, that everyone in NATO needs to ask themselves. And are we willing to put the whole world at risk for this? Because if so, it might very well be the case. I don't know. I'm not in this decision-making position. But what I do know is I have massive admiration for the people of Ukraine.
Oh, you know? I'm the same. I'm the same. For those people to get up and do that is just, I don't know. It's unreal to see people do that in this day and age where people, I don't know, will people do that in Ireland? Will people get up and fight for Ireland these days?
I don't know, man.
I don't think people in Australia
there would definitely be a lot of people who would, of course. But I think if you have a threat on your border, like Taiwan has had for years, and Ukraine has had, obviously, I think it helps you to be more cognizant of your values and what's actually important to you, because you're more constantly reminded of what is worth protecting. Whereas I think we've had in the West, we've had at large, we've had such comfort that we've allowed ourselves to get caught up in bizarre arguments as to whether males can be females and whether it's okay for male athletes to hammer female athletes in women's sport. You know, whether you're classified as a racist for raising concerns about the fact that anti-racism protests were totally fine, but anti-lockdown protests were too dangerous because of the virus. You know, you get called a racist and you get called a transphobe. J.K. Rowling is a Nazi transphobe, apparently. Like, we get caught up in these absurd arguments. You get called a bigot for raising concerns around people being hired because of identity characteristics rather than competency and whether they're a good person and they're competent for the job. You get called a bigot for that kind of thing. It's like, how have we? And I think it's quite simple. How? Not simple, but I think it's multifactorial. But I think a component of it is we've been so comfortable that we've forgotten how fragile what we have actually is. That the fact that like an open, free society is actually an anomaly in human history. It's only like Ireland hasn't even been its own country for 100 years yet. Like, you know, War of Independence was only finished 100 years ago this year.
Yeah, 21. And
last year, and the Civil War is like Michael Collins. The anniversary for Michael Collins' death is actually on in August. I'm going to be in West Cork for that by chance. But we forgot. Ireland didn't even have its own independence. There was blasphemy laws in Ireland until the mid-90s. It was illegal to be gay in Ireland until the mid-90s. 94 or something, it was illegal to be gay. You know, we've forgotten how brief we've been in this window and how fragile this is that we have to be able to have the luxury to care about stuff that's so cosmetic and surface level, as that like we've been less worried about nuclear annihilation than male athletes destroying female athletes in women's sport. We've had more attention on that. That's how absurd our situation has been, just to use one example. And because there's been way more, like, it's all of a sudden, it's bizarre for me to watch all this jumping up and down on the media over nuclear war and stuff. I'm like, yeah, like how there's this unfortunate, like, I have this like egotistical kind of like this kind of like egotistical, disdainful, I told you so bouncing around in my head that's married and twisted up with I fucking told you, you know? And I fucking, what the fuck? How the fuck is this only now a big problem? The fuck? There's been that being mashed around with this genuine deep sadness. Like at the same time, there's like this disdainful I told you so wrapped up by this, and it mingled with this deep sadness at the fucking mad situation that we're in. You know, where we legitimately could be seeing the last of our blue skies. Like, I'm looking out the window here at a beautiful, clear blue sky day, and this might be one of the last blue skies a person that we ever see. Like there might not be blue skies next week, ever again in a human eye will ever see.
And it sounds funny, but it could be true the way things are at the moment. That's not like a flipping remark. You're dead right. I've actually thought about that this week, going to get a coffee or going for a run or whatever. I'm like, man, the way things are in the world at the moment, this could just fucking all end. And that's what it was like for people who don't remember in the 80s or even before that. But even growing up as a kid, you know, my wife and I were talking about that the other day. My wife's a couple of years older than me, and we were just talking about how we remember that as kids, this threat of, you know, nuclear war. It's crazy. It's fucking crazy. Like,
and it's a different scenario now to what it was as well in many ways. Especially if the likes of your man Gary Loughlin is correct, and that there's religious underpinnings got to do with some kind of like cosmic forces and the specialness of the Russian people.
Yeah, that's
scary. A very different. That's along the lines of, that's in the same category as suicide bombing kind of mentality of like, if you genuinely believe, and I don't know if this is the case, but if you genuinely believe that there's like cosmic forces that are justifying your actions because of some special teleological destiny to the Russian people, that's way closer to suicide bombing territory than it is to atheistic communist Russia and this desire to to expand the ideology of communism, knowing because religion was banned. And there was people knew that when they died, they had this thing, when they die, like, and because you couldn't be religious in communist Soviet Union. It was illegal. You know, the priests, the Russian Orthodox priests were gulagged, literally put in the fucking gulags. You know, so this is a way more concerning situation than the Cuban Missile Crisis in some ways, because if that's the case, if there is this kind of like cosmic forces narrative bouncing around in the people's heads who have their fingers over the red button, that's a different ball game to Cold War, where there was these where even though there was way more weapons and the technology was worse and there was loads of close calls, like we've talked about before, with Stanislav Petrov and Vasily Arkhipov, etc. But this is a different thing. And it's something that I only really came to mind for me. And it may very well be that this is all just rhetoric. And realistically, what they want is just to bully the West, take over the Ukraine, get access to the ocean through Ukraine, get access to the really fertile lands, get access to the mineral wealth, because the Russian economy is shit. And they don't actually, and this is all just rhetoric, and they're just trying to say it to scare the West. That might be a possibility as well. Like, I don't know.
And hopefully it is.
Hopefully it is. That would be it, because that would make it much less concerning. But if that kind of, like that quote I read earlier on from that Russian media personality who was basically saying, like, what's the point of the world if Russia isn't in it? That's the kind of thing that you'd like all of our political leaders who are chest puffing and acting the hard man behind podiums to keep in mind, and to be openly talking about, and to be trying to talk to Russian leaders about. It's like, look, man, what are we doing here? Like, are we actually willing to put the whole world at risk here? And we need, as a population, that's what we need to be talking about as well. Not thinking that the problem is over there and it's nothing got to do with us, or isn't it awful what's happening, or look how great the Ukrainian people are, and then thinking that it's not going to come to our doors. Because, for example, like I was playing around with different thought experiments, and I was like, if you back Putin enough into a corner, and his people, let's say, and they reach a place where the sanctions are as bad as they can go, the populace has tried to have protests and uprisings and have been suppressed brutally by their military and police that have killed its own people, let's say, like Tiananmen Square shit. And then eventually you end up with, why would Russia literally not hold the world ransom? Like, why not literally ransom? Because they can go, well, look, we're going to put a mushroom cloud, we're going to send a signal. And I was thinking, what's a really good way to send a signal? Well, you go to a neutral country like Ireland, and then you go to an airport that has been facilitating American military for decades to go east, to refuel, etc. So then you put a mushroom cloud over Shannon Airport, and you basically say, now, here's the crack. Lift the fucking sanctions. Stop fucking around. We're going to do what we want. Lift the fucking sanctions. Give us what we want, or we're going to see more of this. Why wouldn't they do that if they get backed enough into a corner? Genuinely, because what do they have to lose? You know, maybe they're afraid of death. Maybe they're afraid, but maybe they're not. Maybe they're like, well, maybe we think we can get away with this because they're not going to shoot back. Ireland isn't in NATO, is it?
No.
You know, we're in the UN. We're not in NATO. So it's a non-NATO country, not subject to NATO agreements. It's in the EU and the UN, but it's not in NATO. Put a mushroom cloud over Shannon Airport, send a signal, and then literally hold the world ransom. You know?
All right.
That might sound really extreme, but this is war. Like,
no,
this isn't even last. Like, anything could happen. Like, you know, and this isn't the way it's been addressed. This isn't the way it's been talked of.
No, I think you're right. I think that's plenty for this evening. I think I think we'll probably talk about this crisis over the next few weeks, and hopefully we'll be talking about it being over. I don't think this is going to be a one and done episode for us. So anyway, we'll leave it there for this evening. Hopefully our next episode out will be Rob Wolf, who was recently on the Joe Rogan Experience, talking about his book, Sacred Cow. And Rob is scheduled to come on the podcast next week on the 10th of March, I believe. It's a midnight one for me, but it's worth getting up for or staying up for. And Rob is going to be on talking, I think, a little bit about health stuff, and we might go on a little bit of a COVID rampage there for an hour with Rob, and I might lose the fucking Rod. So yeah, we'll be chatting to Rob on the 10th, and Rob has agreed to come onto the podcast. So it was great to see him on Rogan's podcast. He's been on there a couple of times, and we'll have Rob on in a few weeks. Any departing comments there about Rob in the next episode, Ciaran? Or
I have a quote here from Albert Einstein that I think is a nice one to finish on.
Give it to me.
Where he said, yeah. Where you got to think as well, Einstein was one of the lads who sparked the development of the nuclear weapon as well. And maybe we could talk about the actual history of that sometime. But I don't think we ever really went down the rabbit hole. And actually, we did actually talk about the Manhattan Project a good bit before in a previous episode. Actually,
yeah, we did. We did a little bit.
Yeah. But so this is from 1946, according to the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists, who control the doomsday clock, and apparently it's 100 seconds to midnight at the moment. So Einstein said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe." That go through? You froze there for a second.
Isn't that great? The last final quote of the thing, and it froze. So you have to read that again. I think we lost that.
I'll read it. Yeah, I will. Yeah, I might have reading it twice, depending on the way this comes out in the video. So this is from 1946. Einstein said, "The unleashed power of the atom has changed everything, save our modes of thinking, and we thus drift toward unparalleled catastrophe."
There you go. If it came out twice in the video and the audio, great. You need to hear that twice. Until next time. Until next time, keep your head down. Don't fuck about. See you later.